Kia ora, katoa katoa, nā mai, haere mai. My name is William Wilkinson, and welcome to another Pulsok event with great help from PAV, where we'll be having for a speaker tonight David Seymour, the leader of the ACT Party.
Hello, I'm Felix, President of the Subcommittee Political Living of Victoria. We've had Maori Party, we've had Opportunities Party, now we've got David Seymour, and upcoming we've got the Green Party. So excited to hear from David. Hopefully David goes into the government this year and tells them to get their act together. And yeah, so yeah.
Without further ado, we give you David Seymour.
Well, thanks guys, and thanks to Pulsok because, sorry, I'll just go back a bit, because I think there's obviously a huge appetite for people to do what I call politics in full sentences, because we spend most of our time in Parliament trying to craft that winning soundbite or tweet that will get serious airtime and get you on the 6 o'clock news. But hopefully what this will allow us in the next hour is to have a bit more of a complete conversation about what you guys actually want out of us, because ultimately we work for you, you vote for us, you put us in Parliament, and you'd hope to get a little bit of return on that deal. And so I just want to talk about 5 issues, and don't worry, they'll all be quite quick, that will actually hopefully provoke some more discussion and give you a sense of what ACT's values and priorities are, and what you might be getting if you tick the box for ACT on September 23. And I'll start with what I think is the biggest one in so many ways, in economic terms, in polling, and what people say to me on the street and around university campuses, and that is the housing market. And I know that people in the Wellington region are facing enormous pressure for rent, and I know that there's people who are actually going back to gardening. It's like for the first time since World War II. There's a lot of people who are growing food in their backyard because they're basically pretty hard up between what you can borrow, which I'll talk about a bit later, and the price of rent in this city. And not to be a martyr, but it's probably worse in Auckland. Whereas some of those flats in North Dunedin, thankfully they probably still pay you to actually live in. But you know, this is a fundamental problem. And oddly enough, I spent about 5 years of my life working for a political think tank in Canada on this topic. And Canada and the US are great places to do it because they've got a couple of hundred cities and they all have different policies. And some of them grow really fast and provide a huge amount of housing, and they become popular, and prices stay low, and people are generally kind of happy. And then there's other cities where it's very hard to build anything, and they end up with a massive shortage of housing and a shortage of quality, dry, affordable, warm housing as a result of the different policies that they take. And the interesting thing is that here in New Zealand, for the last 20 years or so, we have adopted the worst of the policies that you see across North America. I'm talking about drawing lines around cities and saying, thou shalt not build beyond this line, because if you're a good person, you'll live very close together, a little bit like Europeans do. They say that we can't afford the infrastructure to build new homes, and the councils aren't very willing to consent new homes because they're worried that if they screw up again and the buildings leak, then the councils end up being liable. And one of the results of that is that the number of homes that get built every year in New Zealand compared to the number of people has halved since the 1970s. In the height of the baby boom, when the baby boomers were in their 30s and they were at peak home buying mode, they just mowed stuff down and built houses like mofos all over New Zealand. 39,000 houses peak in 1974, and in the last year, despite supposedly being, according to Nick Smith, the biggest construction boom in New Zealand's history, which is kind of true because they got so much more expensive, they're worth more, so he's measuring it in dollars. You've actually got a situation where we're building fewer homes today with better technology and 1.5 million more people than we were 40 years ago. And I know other people will come here and they'll talk about the tax rates and the interest and the bank policies and the foreigners investing and all the rest of it. But the fundamental issue is that if there are too many people for too few houses, then the prices keep going up, and some people, sadly, get squeezed out and live in cars and garages and so on. So you've got to work out how to build more homes, and my view is that the laws we have around using land and where you're allowed to build and what you're allowed to build are far too constrained. And also there's not enough money in councils to actually build infrastructure and decent transport to go up to people. So if you want a couple of policies, and I released this in January for my State of the Nation speech because I think housing is the most important issue, we need to completely replace the land use planning that we have in cities, the RMA, the Resource Management Act. It's 25 years old. It's been amended 19 times by Labor and National and every other government, and I guarantee you the 20th amendment won't fix it. So the next government should say, we've got a serious problem. People aren't building enough homes, and we're actually going to get together for 3 years and we're going to replace that law with something that has a priority of building homes like baby boomers did. And the second thing I'd say, there's no point freeing up land if you cannot access money for infrastructure. And I'd say we're going to give half the GST on construction, which is about $2.5 billion a year, to the council that issues the consent. Because one of the things people in the building industry will tell you is that they can't get councils to give them resource consent to build much. You wait till you see how enthusiastic councils are to consent stuff when they know they're getting 7.5% of the value of the house being built, because that's the GST that otherwise would have gone to central government. And if you did that, we would have a land use planning regime that was kind of like a mixture of what they have in Germany and Switzerland and what they have in places like Texas and Georgia, where they actually build houses and have affordable housing in far higher standards than we do. Both bold moves, but the kind of thing you want to do if you fix it. If you want to sit around here and tinker with the tax system and blame the Asians for buying too many houses, I guarantee you there'll still be too many people, not enough houses, rising prices, and people renting pretty shitty flats for pretty high rents. So that's number one, and it has a generational factor to it. All of these things do. I mentioned that the peak of home building in New Zealand miraculously coincided with the time that baby boomers were in their 30s at peak home buying age. And at the same time, we've subsequently stopped the rate of home building at exactly the time that the baby boomer generation hold most of the assets, and of course stand to gain enormously from holding those assets. Now, why would a government do that? Well, basically, in 1990, so for the 70s and 80s, the baby boomers were under 40. There was one under 40 voter for every over 40 voter, and so you had a fairly fair sort of a contest. Today, for every vote cast by someone under 40, there are 2 votes cast by someone over 40. And so you wonder why there's not a lot of will to move on building more homes and making the market fair. That's the politics of it. But people that agree with me and agree that it's an issue and want to fix it, you've got to decide to vote for a party that is pro-housing supply, that's a housing expansionist party. And we can have a discussion about some of the details of that and questions if you like. But the next big issue that is much simpler and is actually just crystal clear, and it also comes down to that over 40, under 40 demographic unfairness or imbalance in voting numbers, is superannuation. And most people in this room, I think it's probably no one in this room actually, who expects they'll get superannuation at 2/3 the average wage when they turn 65. It's just incredibly unlikely to happen. If it did, we'd be the only country in the world doing it by that stage, and there'd be 2 taxpayers supporting every super annuitant. I mean, it's almost a full-time job for them. So there's going to be change. Everyone knows there's going to be change. And the sad thing is that no one has the guts to actually say it. And let's just go across the political spectrum. The Labor Party actually campaigned on this alongside ACT and the Greens in 2014. Now they're not. The Greens campaigned on raising the age of superannuation and making it fairer sooner in 2014 as well. Now they're not. The New Zealand First parties think that it would all be fine if we didn't have so many immigrants, even though the average immigrant pays about $2,000 more net tax than anyone else, so stopping immigration might actually not be a good idea on that one. And then you've got the National Party, or the Maori Party, view it entirely as an issue of Maori fairness, and I've got some sympathy for that, but they're not addressing the issue in aggregate. And then the National Party, in some ways, are the worst, because their policy is they will start raising the age of superannuation in 2037. And there's a few things about that. One is that they all know that none of them are going to be there. I mean, even the most ambitious national politician, you know, unless they have absolutely no other life options, which in some cases, true, you know, they're not going to be there in 2037. So and even if they were, I mean, it'd be a little bit like sitting around now and saying, well, in 1997 you said, there's no mileage in that. So they've created a promise that is totally unaccountable, totally unenforceable. The second thing about it is that even if they could do it, it's incredibly unfair, because it means that you guys are basically all going to be in the workforce for the next 2 to 4 years. And it means that you're all going to be paying taxes to people to get super at 65 and 66 for the next 20. And the total cost of that is $58 billion. So you've got a $58 billion tax bill because the National Party are too scared to take one little baby boomer privilege, even a minor fair adjustment, away. And I just think that's pathetic. So for the record, AXView, and how many people here have used Excel? Okay, you're all pretty qualified to work this out. The fair way to do it is to maintain people getting super for about 24% of their life. We know how fast life expectancy is rising, and if you wanted to achieve that, you'd start raising the age in 2020, which means it would have been in last week's budget, because the budget's a 4-year forecast now. And you'd raise it by 2 months a year through to 2032, and that would save people in this room almost $60 billion in tax. So that's the second issue that I think we should be addressing. And the third one flows on from that, and funnily enough, it's connected, it's tax. Because I don't know how many people have come up to me at a YoPro thing, Auckland Young Professional, Wellington Young Professional, you know, insert city here, YoPro, and said, look, basically, I always thought the ACT Party were a bunch of arseholes, but then I got my first PAYE slip. Jesus Christ, I had no idea. And they're saying, look, you know, I'm a few years out of my study, about to hit 70k, and my next pay rise will be 33% of the margin in tax, because that's what you pay on that. Still haven't paid off my student loan, so that's another 12, so 45% of it. If I spend any of the money, then that's going to be, you know, 15% GST on the remaining 55, so you're up to sort of 53. And, you know, of course, no one should smoke cigarettes. That's silly. But if you did, then don't even talk to me about that excise tax. And then, you know, you've got the booze, which obviously you should drink in moderation, but also highly taxed. And then you've got petrol, which you shouldn't use because you might cook the planet. But, you know, if you do, that's highly taxed too. So potentially 60% of your next pay rise is going into government coffers to pay for a budget that does nothing about super. In fact, actually just gave a major increase in super because super is taxed, and so the tax cuts all go to people that get super. And that basically is hosing money at people that the National Party has identified as being marginal voters who might go to Labour, but not if you give them $100 a week. And that's the most cynical way to govern. And so I say, look, the government had, you know, a $24 billion surplus over 4 years. Now, there's two things you can do. You can either spend it and spend it in a cynical political way, or you can give it back to the people that earned it. Are the two basic options that you have. And the ACT Party has always been of the view that before government can tax money, people have to earn it. Ergo, it's your money. Ergo, wherever possible, you should actually get to keep it. And hey, if some future government disagrees, they can put it back up. But for now, you shouldn't be paying more tax than is required to fund health, education, roads, police, military, etc. So that's the third thing, is that you need to be more aggressive on tax because, again, you've got a coalition of voters who want more expenditure, they're dominant, but younger people in the main, a few years out of uni, actually start to see the burden of that and would like to cut, and I think that they need a voice, and I'm more than happy to provide it. Something that's quite specific and tertiary focused is I have no idea how you guys survive. Are you all trust fund babies? I mean, seriously. I mean, I started uni in 2001, and from 1999 until then and through to 2006, the maximum amount you could borrow from study loan was, is it still called study loan?
Yeah.
Sweet, I'm not totally out of touch yet. I'm on Snapchat, by the way. I just DBS83. I just put it out there. But the maximum you could borrow was $150, and I paid rent then of about $120 in Auckland, which was high. People here in Wellington were paying $80 in rent, and so after your maximum drawdown, you actually still. You could almost live off that. And now you have a situation where most people, as I understand it, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I talk to people that go, Vic, they're basically $20 behind after their maximum drawdown on their loan. I won't talk about allowances are a little bit better off, but even people that are going to have to repay the money can barely borrow enough to live. And as someone who worked all the way through uni, sometimes did 40 hours a week, I can tell you the evidence is in my transcript. It's not a good way to do it. So that's why I had to go into politics instead of engineering. But in any case, the sensible thing to do would be to index it to property prices, to living costs and housing costs, to rental indexes rather than to inflation. Because it's true, there's been no inflation in other things. That's absolutely fair. But we've had almost zero inflation since the Great Financial Crisis, but there's been massive inflation in property prices, and that's flowed into rents due to the original issue I talked about. And so, my view is that an honest way to do it would be to go back to about 2006 when it was still semi-reasonable, index it to rental indexes, and actually give people some shot at borrowing and studying and so on. You still have to pay it back, but at least you're not going to kill yourself in the process. And I just don't understand why no government has been prepared to do that. It's a decent thing to do, and you're not even giving people money. So that's number 4. It's a relatively simple thing, and it's a relatively easy thing to do. But I just don't know why it hasn't been done. But finally, those are all economic issues. A big part of my reason for being in politics is summed up by a really simple phrase that it's actually an old Ben Harper song. How many people know who Ben Harper is? Oh, maybe I am. At least it's better on study that. So it's from the song Burn One Down. It's a great song. And it has the great line, my choice is what I choose to do. If I'm causing no harm, it shouldn't bother you. Your choice is who you choose to be, and if you're causing no harm, then you're all right with me. And I just think that's a fabulous way to live your life. It's far better than being judgmental and persecuting and basically oppressing other people just because they're different. It gets rid of intolerance. It gets rid of tall poppy syndrome. It's really a celebration of the difference and specialness in all of us. And I think that is just a wonderful philosophy to start with. And that informs pretty much everything I do on the social issues. And I'll give you one example. I'm the only member out of 121 members of Parliament to put a bill in the ballot on assisted dying. Now, I know this is not something that people will be thinking about a lot in their late teens and early 20s, or at least you shouldn't be. But, you talk to older people who are focused on their health and how their life will end, or people who have been unfortunate enough to have a degenerative condition. And I've met people with muscular dystrophy, with Huntington's disease, with MS, and you have someone who gets a terminal disease like cancer. You get to the end of your life and you have a couple of choices, and none of them are good. And this will sound macabre, but I'm pretty much quoting out of the Canadian Supreme Court when they legalised it there. and that is that you can refuse food and water, and effectively end your life. You can refuse treatments for medical treatments. You can kill yourself. It's not illegal to commit suicide in New Zealand. That's an option that they reckon about 8% of elderly suicides are actually deliberate because they had some sort of terminal or degenerative condition. Or you can get a doctor to give you just a little bit too much morphine, and that's kind of legal because the doctors say, oh, we were just trying to kill the pain. What you can't do is what's legal in Canada, in California, in Montana, in Oregon, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, and oddly enough in Bolivia, which I don't know a lot about. But, and that is to go through a perfectly safeguarded process and have the legal right to go on your terms surrounded by your loved ones, rather than having to either suffer till the bitter end, commit a lonely amateur suicide, which sadly some people still do when they're very sick, or have a doctor's kind of do it informally, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, which apparently, according to Auckland Med School, happens to about 4% of cases in New Zealand. And so that's a substantial number of people. I mean, when you're in the ACT Party, 4% is like shit. So it's good to see everyone watches the poll. But the point in all that, it is a very important issue to me. But the point in all that is that I'm prepared, and the ACT Party generally is prepared to stand up for issues of conscience and issues of social liberty. And the other one that I didn't get anywhere near as much trouble as I thought I would, but I had to say it, was abortion. It's just nuts. I mean, if you want an abortion, you have to go and basically pretend you're a criminal, pretend you're insane. Legally, that's what the law says. It's 40 years old, and it's stupid. And what strikes me is that there's all these people in Parliament who tell you they're feminists, who stage a walkout of Parliament because John Key made some admittedly pretty stupid comments. All of them could put a bill in the ballot. Every member of Parliament who's not a minister has a right to put a bill in the ballot. I turned down becoming a minister and 50 grand pay rise and limo and all that so I could keep my bill in. And these guys won't put anything in. See you later, else. And I just think that is absolutely gutless on their part. I can't put another bill in because I've already got one. But I just think it's one of those issues where people should have their choices respected. And people shouldn't have to pretend and engage in a subterfuge in order to get what they want when they're not doing anything wrong. So there's a second issue. And the final one that I'm sure you would have heard a bit about if you were here last week is cannabis prohibition. And I think cannabis prohibition has been a terrible failure. And here's how, if you're into public policy analysis, I mean, here's how you can analyse a policy. There's just three simple questions. You do this with any policy if you want. Number one, what is the policy intended to achieve? Number two, what has been the effectiveness of the policy? And number three, what have been the unintended consequences or the side effects of the policy? And if you're asking that question about cannabis prohibition, well, obviously, number one, the purpose is to stop people smoking cannabis. Number two, has it been effective? Well, no. I mean, 10% of New Zealanders do it every year. I mean, how many laws do 10% of people break, other than jaywalking? I mean, this is like a really shit job from law enforcement. And half of New Zealanders have broken it at some time. So that's going disastrously. And thirdly, and this is where it gets really bad, is, well, what have been some of the unintended consequences? Well, the unintended consequence is that if you do want to get cannabis, you've got to go basically to the Hells Angels, Black Power, or the Mongrel Mob, or someone downstream from them. And so you're connected to a criminal world, and these guys, I'm told, do not follow the Consumer Guarantees Act. They don't give refunds. They will try to upsell you onto harder and actually more dangerous drugs. And the other bizarre incentive they have is to make it much more concentrated. Because if you think about it, if you grow a plant, you take a risk, you get caught. So you might as well grow a super concentrated plant that will get 10 people stoned instead of a plant that's only going to get 2 people stoned. And so this is why we got moonshine in the US during Prohibition when they prohibited alcohol. Who wants to smuggle beer? It's not very powerful. They created moonshine and strong spirits in the US because they were easy to smuggle for the number of people they could get this. So one of the funny things about prohibition is that it actually makes the thing you try to prohibit more concentrated. So you'd have to say noble intention, arguable, effectiveness, hopeless, and unintended consequences, disastrous. Having said all of that, I think New Zealand is 5 or 10 years away from moving for the simple reason that 80% of people support medical or medicinal. No problem. That could happen tomorrow. If Damien O'Connor's bill gets drawn from the ballot, I think it might happen. But when it comes to full legalisation, which I think is the right thing to do, 80% of people are opposed. And, I'm principled and spirited and everything, but I'm not going to go and stand on the steps of Parliament, pour petrol on myself, set my political career on fire. Because I know people, then I'll be all gone, and people say, oh, what a shame. See if we can get another one. Well, not everyone, some people will be happier, but, But, so, look, I think what's going to happen is that people are going to see the experience in Canada starting next July, the experience in Colorado from starting 2 years ago, experience in California. These are big jurisdictions that speak the same language as us, have similar histories, basically being British colonies of some sort. And as that happens, people will start to change their mind, and the law will change in New Zealand too. So I'm behind it, but not to the point of being politically destroyed. Let me just also talk a little bit about MMP, because I didn't vote for it. None of you did. I know you didn't. I was in Standard 3, as we used to call Year 5 when MMP came in. But it's kind of one of these things we've inherited, and we all have to live with it. And so the basic way it works is that I need to win the Epsom electorate. And I just got a poll back today saying that I'm 12 points ahead at this stage, so I think I probably will win it, as long as people don't find out about the thing. Just kidding. There's no thing. There's not a thing. And then, well, it's not much of a thing. But anyway, once that happens, it's just a matter of how many votes can we get. It's a drag race, basically. So if we get to 1.2, 1.3%, I get a friend. And I'd just like to appeal to you, as I was saying on backbenches last week, you might disagree with everything I've said tonight. You might think I'm the stupidest politician you've ever heard, but just give your party vote for ACT to help get me a friend. I'm appealing to your better nature. But if you do agree with our policy, you still vote for us, because we get to about 2.1% roughly. It's slightly imprecise, then I get 2 friends. And 2.8% I get a third friend. There'll be 4 of us. 3.5% there'll be 5 of us. That's like a party, it's like a political party. And I think the long-term vision as a party of more than one person that can seriously influence New Zealand politics and push people towards better policies that are fairer for younger generations. And if I give you just one small example of how we're changing that, it's this. A lot of you will have heard various things about charter schools, and probably very few of you will have visited one. And generally speaking, there's 2 kinds of people. There's people who are opponents because they're in a teacher union who hate them, and people that have visited them and love them. So if you're in the middle, I would suggest visiting a charter school rather than joining a teacher union. But the fact of the matter is that we have taken people like Raylan Tipene in Whangarei, which funnily enough is where I grew up, and she said, right, 86% of Māori boys in my town are failing. And it's not good enough. Failing NCA level 1. If you fail NCA level 1 in the 21st century, you're kind of screwed. And so she set up a school called Te Kapuku Whetū, and she said, we're going to do this our way. We're going to get away from the teachers who, frankly, are discriminatory against Māori kids in many cases. We're going to make these kids feel valued and connected with their Māoritanga. And roughly, it's not quite perfect, I can't remember the exact number, but roughly 86% of boys are now passing in her school NCA level 1. So that is the kind of transformation that we're making. We're saying we're going to have a totally new set of educators coming in, setting up totally new schools, to change kids' lives for the better. And at the moment, we've got 1,256 kids whose lives are being totally changed, many of whom, probably about a quarter of whom, weren't actually going to any school a while ago. At one of the schools, we found a 14-year-old kid who there was no record of him in the New Zealand education system. I mean, I wish I'd known how to get away from that with that when I was younger, but I mean, obviously that's disastrous in terms of consequences for the rest of his life and the community around him. So I finish on charter schools because they're just a little column of light about what it can achieve, working together with other parties in government. And we've worked very well with the Māori Party, who support this because they know that basically the system they've been given has been pretty rubbish for their supporters and their people. We've worked with the National Party because it's not their favourite thing, but they're prepared to tolerate it. And we've managed to create the space for a real revolution in education. And it is a real revolution, you can tell, because our opponents spend so much time rubbishing it. They're terrified that it's going to take off and start putting some real competition into what is currently a monopoly sector. So there you go, there's a bit of housing, a bit of super, a bit of tax, a bit of student loan borrowing limit level amount and indexation to the right thing, and a bit of social liberalism, a bit of MMP, and a little bit of proof of what a little party that can has already achieved. So I'll leave you there. I'm happy to take any questions, and hopefully I haven't gone on too long. But I really I think we live in a great place where you can get 80 or 100 people in a room who are prepared to actually engage in our democracy and hear what the different options on the table are. And I hope I've been interested enough to hold your attention. Thank you.
All right, we have some time left, so we can take some questions if anybody has any. Do you want to raise your hand? Yep.
Sir.
Capital gains tax, why or why not?
Well, I don't favour it. There's two reasons you might want a capital gains tax. And again, three questions. What's the intention of the policy? How effective is it? And what are the unintended consequences? So usually the intention is it will suppress house prices. Well, no, it won't. And we know this because in London, in LA, in Vancouver, in Sydney, in Melbourne, all those places have a CGT. And all of them have had house prices near enough to, if not over, 10 times income, which is where Auckland's at right now. The median income is 10 times, sorry, the median house price is 10 times the median income. So it actually hasn't worked suppressing house prices. And if you think about it, if you go back to that scenario where there's too many people trying to get into too few houses, and the price is going up 100 grand a year, you put a 30% CGT on it, but, I'm still making 70 grand. I mean, who doesn't want to make 70 grand for not really doing anything? So, it doesn't work suppressing house prices. It's not effective. And the final thing is, well, what are the unintended consequences? Well, one of them is that actually it would reduce the attractiveness of getting into the property game. It's actually going to disincentivize people building more homes, which is actually the opposite of what we're trying to achieve right now. And finally, it makes the tax system far more complicated to administer because, at the moment, basically, you earn income, it goes into POA, you pay tax, you go and buy something, GST, the shop takes all the GST that it's paid, minuses it from what it's received from customers and sends it to IRD. It's pretty simple. I mean, tax compliance is a pain in the ass everywhere, but it's not that bad, really. With a capital gains tax, well, first of all, it's never going to include the family home. Oh, no. I mean, believe me, we're in favour of, better policy, but we're not politically suicidal, you understand? So then you've got to work out what is the family home. And I went through this on the Finance and Expenditure Committee when we were debating this bright line test, this 2-year bright line test. And then we have come up with these ridiculous scenarios. So, there's like a family and they put one home in trust and the husband likes to go out and stay at the beach house and but that's his primary home and then she owns the other one, and do they have to pay capital gains tax if they sell the beach house? And in the end, these IRD people came in. I said, look, do you think it'll be easier? Well, first I said, is this the most ridiculous thing that ministers have ever asked you to do? And they're like, we can't possibly comment. And second of all, I was like, you know, would it be easier to work out where people live if only you're allowed to put cameras in their homes? And then the IRD people started salivating, and I was like, well, so I don't suggest things like that anymore, because, you know, like, seriously, there's some people you shouldn't joke around. But one of the issues is that, you know, then you've got to work out, are you going to tax them every year based on the valuation, or do you tax them when they sell it, and, you know, do they get to deduct any money that they put into renos, and are they going to keep their receipts from 5 years ago when they put in a new kitchen and deduct that? I mean, it's just a nightmare. So, you know, I don't favour it because it won't achieve what you think it's going to achieve. Building more houses will. And second of all, the unintended consequences of it are quite extensive. And the final thing is that actually there's from this point it just gets more arcane, but yeah, there's the two basic reasons I oppose it.
Any more questions?
Sir at the back.
I talked a lot about economic policy, but going into the next election, do you or the ACT Party have any policy or opinion on environmental issues, in particular climate change?
Oh, absolutely. That's a whole different speech. So, first of all, if you look at climate change, you've got to accept a few things about New Zealand, is that we're 0.2% of global emissions. So what we do is only going to work if it works in concert with what other people are prepared to do. So that's your first big issue. And the second thing is that, you know, you can sign up to as many agreements as you like, but the rest of the world has been hopeless at actually following through. I mean, you look at what they say they're going to do, what they sign up for, what they actually do. And generally it's been pretty disappointing. They're now setting, I mean, you know, you've got to love Nick Smith. I mean, well, in a sort of love-hate way. You know, I mean, basically, when it became clear that they weren't going to make the current targets, they then just set even more ambitious targets even further out. So it's sort of the classic bait and switch, and most countries are doing that in some way, shape or form. So then you say, okay, well, you know, we could lead the world, we could really go up hard on this, and we could go for bigger reductions than every other country. But of course, first of all, you're going to be pretty hard pressed to find any government that can keep getting elected like that. You look what happened to Julia Gillard, you look what happened to Michael Ignatieff. He introduced the carbon shift policy and got stomped in the Canadian election in 2008. And there's other examples of how that's happened around the world. So my view is, okay, those are your constraints. You can't change the climate as one country. You can't trust the rest of the world to do stuff. And if you go too far ahead of them, then you pay a big political penalty. So then you say, well, what is stuff that New Zealand can do that we're not doing that makes a lot of sense anyway? And one of them, I'll give you one really obvious one, is most of our emissions are transport related apart from agriculture. And you know, so that's a whole different kettle of fish. So if we just focus on transport for a second, you know, everybody here should have a license to be an Uber driver. I mean, it should be as easy as getting a passport. You should be able to write in just like getting a passport or a driver's license, and they'll send you a thing having checked your criminal record and your driving history, that you're not a maniac and you're not a murderer. And I think you would see, especially amongst younger people that drive, a huge number of people doing casual rides. You know, I commute, I go to uni, I do whatever, and getting up our vehicle occupancy rate. I mean, this is a smart thing we should do anyway to ease congestion. It would be massively helpful on that issue. Another thing that we should absolutely be doing is charging people to use roads. So, you know, at the moment, if you take a bus and there's 50 of you, and then in front of you are 50 people all sitting in cars, you're getting ripped off because they're paying bugger all road user fees to use this thing at peak hours. And so what can you do? You know, you've got a real problem here, and the solution to that problem is to start charging people, especially at peak times, to use roads, give a reward to people that do use alternatives, and actually a penalty for all those single occupancy vehicles, because that's what's driving emissions and that's what's driving congestion as well. So there's two basic things that you could do that make sense anyway. On the agriculture, it's just really, really hard, because basically you've got three options. Status quo, and continue to have high emissions, and you can do that and say, well, you know, it's mostly foreigners that eat the food and drink the milk anyway, so maybe they should worry about it. It's an option. Number two is to seriously reduce New Zealand's agricultural output. or at least make them buy credits from offshore, which is roughly the same thing. Or number 3 is to wait for a technological miracle, which may well happen, but if it does, we don't need the policy. If it doesn't happen, the policy is no good. So that's not really a policy option. So I would say out of those, there's going to be a reduction in total land use by cows and sheep in the next decade or so because of the land use plans that are going in by councils across the country. But there's always, anyone that comes in here and says we're just going to stop the New Zealand economy is lying to you. So that comes back to my view that there'll be some reduction in agricultural activity anyway, but there's also a million things, and I've just given you 2 examples. Another one is having decent water markets that will actually help us mitigate and adapt without having to kill ourselves politically, economically, or otherwise. More broadly on environmental policy, the biggest thing I've kind of campaigned on and released lately is that we should be selling Landcorp because it's almost making a loss. Taxpayers are giving cheap capital to more dairy conversions, which is the opposite of what we're trying to achieve elsewhere. And we should actually put the proceeds into a trust. Again, it's something we should do anyway because we're losing money on it. Put it into a trust that makes grants to have wildlife sanctuaries. And if you've visited Zealandia, Maungatātari, Brook Sanctuary, I've visited them all, and they are amazing places. They're a great coming together of people, of volunteers to actually bring back New Zealand's flora and fauna. I think this is a really positive thing, but they're almost all broke. And so I would use the proceeds of Landcorp, which is doing environmental harm, and I would give them to people that are actually trying to do environmental good, and I'd put them on contracts to achieve certain things like bring back enough birds and plant enough trees and kill enough rats, etc. And you'd be amazed. I think there'd be community groups in every town in New Zealand that would bring back a sanctuary, and that would be probably one of the most powerful things we could do for one of our urgent problems, which is biodiversity. But as general principles, I talk about the 4 Ps. Property rights, because people look after things they own. Our fishing quota management system is a fantastic example of what you get with private property rights. People actually conserve fish far better than most other countries and than they did prior to 1986. Private initiative, because most of the conservation in New Zealand is done not by people that complain, but people that get out and actually do. Often people that hate rats and love killing them, but that's, everyone's got a role to play. Then there's pricing. And we don't accurately price our roads, we don't accurately price our water, and that's why so much waste goes on. These are market solutions to conservation. And finally, prosperity. Wealthy countries can afford to have, this is one of my favourite kakapo stories, I have a few, but I'll just share one tonight, and is that, this kakapo is nesting and it gets the flu, and there's actually people watching it with a kakapo baby monitor, I guess it would be called a chick monitor, and when they detect that it's got the flu, they go and take it out of the bush, bring it back, give it antibiotics, and then grow it up into a big, strong kakapo that goes out and probably continues its sexless decline into extinction. But wealthy countries can do stuff like that. Poor countries can't. So pricing, property rights, private initiative, and prosperity are the principles. Having a few more sanctuaries would be great, and on climate change, doing stuff that makes sense anyway, especially around transport, because our transport technology just seems to get a lot better. Ma'am?
So you're wanting to increase sanctuaries in cities, yet you're wanting to increase the land use for houses. Is that correct? How does that work?
Well, I think you've got to look at the scale of it. At the moment, New Zealand is 0.8% urbanised. So, I fly up and down here to Auckland, at least once a week, and let me tell you, there's some space out there, huge. So I don't think that we face a big difficulty in terms of running out of space, and even if, I'm being a bit facetious about flying over the Central Plateau because no one wants to live there anyway, but, not many people, but even if you take the Auckland region, which is by far the most populated, dense region, so the Auckland region is about 1.2 million acres, and it's forecast to have 1 million people coming. Now, the average house has about 2.5 people in it, if all of them lived on a quarter acre, then every acre would have 4 times 2.5 is 10 people an acre. So, those million people would live on 100,000 acres. Well, that's less than 10% of the Auckland region. To have 1 million people living on a quarter acre, and if anyone's actually seen a quarter acre, there's not many around these days, because most places have intensified a lot in the last 50 years. That's huge. So even if you take a totally ridiculous example, in the most densely populated, sprawling city in the country, and you have 1 million extra people moving in, which is probably not going to happen this side of 2060. You'd still only use 10% of the land. So there is a tension there, and it worries a lot of people. But once you get down to the scale of it, there's room for birds and there's room for people. And if anything, having less dense living, actually, you can actually have a lot more biodiversity in suburbs than you can in, say, Cuba Street.
Do you think that people come to New Zealand though because we have the large spaces of land? Like, obviously tourism is our largest export, but
Yeah.
I think people must come for a reason.
Yeah. Oh, no, I agree that, our biggest asset in terms of tourism, people don't come here because, Wellington's a great city. It is, but if you've been to Paris and New York, it's not that exciting. I wouldn't know, but I've not really been outside of Wellington. But, joke. So I think you're absolutely right about the attraction of New Zealand to tourists. But look, let's say we go from New Zealand being 0.8% urbanised to being 1% urbanised. Well, that's a 25% increase in the amount of land you can build houses on. That's huge. And yet we still have 99% of the country for tourists to look at. So, I just don't think there's a fundamental conflict. Sir?
Talk to me about student fees.
Yep.
Talk to me about why I am paying so much more than people 50 years ago would for the same product, and tell me why that is. Why should we keep doing it? What's the alternative? What will that do?
Yeah. So the reason that you're paying more is that more people get to do it. So 50 years ago, the number of people going to university, going to tertiary studies was bugger all. Right now I wish I had an exact figure, but now for 18 to 24-year-olds, something like 36%. And so the country basically faced a trade-off. You could have a scheme for a tiny proportion of people who mostly went to elite schools and got high marks, and then they basically got paid to go to university. And that was, a nice way to do it, I guess, if you were one of those people. But it was a terribly exclusive way to do it, and it was an unfair way to do it, frankly. So what came along in the early 90s was a belief that, well, actually, we want to increase people's access, and the way that we're going to do it is we're going to say, well, if people are going to be prepared to pay about a third of the cost themselves, then we'll open up access and let a lot more people go. And so we've now got a lot more people at university. So that's the fundamental reason. Is this a follow-up question?
A follow-up question.
Yep.
So I'm not so much talking about how the government funded it, but I'm talking about why, even for the 90s, fees keep rising more and more and more. Where is the economy of scale? Why is it costing us more and more and more to come to university than even the people who came yesterday or last year? What's the reason for that?
Well, the rises in the 90s were a transition between those two schemes. So it started in the early 90s, and by the time I got there in 2001, we were not far behind where you guys are now, although there has been some adjustment. So, that explains the rise in the 90s. And really, the options that you guys had is that, people will come to these events next week or the week after, and they'll say, don't worry, we will pay for, we'll give you 3 years free, for instance, is the Labour Party's policy. And the issue with that is, I'm telling you, it'll be eventually an extra 3 years worth of high school, because you've got no money, you've got no skin in the game. The taxpayer's picking up the entire tab. They've only promised you 3 years free. They haven't promised you any particular level of quality. And so you'll basically end up with, low quality courses an extra 3 years of it. So, look, my view is that as someone who came out of uni with a 45k loan and only paid it off a couple of years ago, in one sense it sucks, but to have the range of courses and the access, and to have the level or the number of people that are able to attend, I think we're in a far better place than we were in, say, the 1960s, when a very small number of people who went to elite schools got a really good deal, and everyone else went to work for the railways union, which was basically was actually the reality of it.
All right, we've got time for just one more question.
Oh, and I'll just say one other thing, is that you guys are going to pay for it anyway, because unless some of my political opponents have a magic money tree in their backyard that they've been really mean and not told us about yet, then whatever tertiary education you consume is going to be paid for by future taxpayers, and that's you. Sir?
Yep. I was just wondering if you could explain a bit about your justification for the Threestrike policy, especially in comparison to the more liberal stuff you were talking about earlier. It seems kind of, has it worked that great in America? Do we really want it here?
Yeah, I mean, what we did was way milder than what they had in the US. So in the US, they say, look, basically 3 strikes and you go to jail for life, and it can be anything. You steal a loaf of bread off for life. Ours is milder in that if you do 3 strikes, you get the maximum sentence for whatever the third crime is, and so that has not led to the same level of mass imprisonment that they've had in the US. And the early data from New Zealand is that people that get strike warnings are less likely to reoffend than people were in the 5 years prior to 3 strikes. So people that within the same period of time that did an equivalent crime used to reoffend more often than they have been after judges have started issuing strike warnings. We don't really know how effective it'll be. It's mildly suppressed crime, but not many, because it's only been around for 6 years. People basically haven't had enough time to commit a crime, serve a term, commit a crime, serve a term, and commit a third crime in order to really evaluate it. So that's the issue. But look, I mean, if you want my view on recidivism and look at where the ACT Party's going and where it's gone since I've been involved, I've introduced a policy that looks at the insight that most prisoners can't read. About 70% are functionally illiterate, and coincidentally about 70% are back inside us within 4 years of release. So my view is, well, how do you meld these things together? There's a lot of volunteers, like up at Remataka, who want to go and teach people to read, and so we've said, look, if you go from being illiterate to literate in prison, we'll take 6 weeks a year off your sentence. And it gives an incentive to corrections because they want to free up the bed space. It gives an incentive to the prisoner because who wants to be in jail, and it gives an incentive to everyone else because the taxpayer saves money, and people that are literate are less likely to reoffend. So, I mean, that's probably more of an indication of where ACT's going in the modern era. But the stuff that other people did when they were involved, they were running the party 10 years ago, I have to say, whether I would have introduced that policy myself is, you'll never know, but it has actually does actually seem to have been fairly effective at what it set out to achieve.
All right, I think we're just going to have to wrap it up here. On behalf of the Politics Friday and of PAV, we'd just like to thank you for taking time to come here and do these roast topics. More fun.
You should.
Thanks for coming, David Seymour, or judging by your Snapchat, David Meemore.
Thank you to all of you for coming up and attending this event. We didn't expect we'd get this many people, and we're absolutely really happy with the turnout.
Yeah.
Have a good evening. Ka kite noho.
We're just going up to the hut for a quick refreshment.